I never thought a single person could have so much control over how I saw myself, how I moved, how I breathed. It started innocently, a small dare, a joke she made one rainy evening when we were stuck together in her apartment after the storm. Her name was Elise, and from the moment I met her, I sensed there was a magnetic force in her presence that drew people in and refused to let go. I had always been comfortable in my own skin, confident even, until that night when she smiled at me in a way that made the world around me blur. She laughed and said, "You know, if you really wanted to understand me, you could try being me for a while." I assumed it was just playful banter. I shrugged it off, but her eyes held a kind of insistence that made me pause. "What do you mean?" I asked, not entirely sure I wanted to know. She tilted her head, her smile curling in a way that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. "I mean exactly what I said. Step into my shoes, see through my eyes, feel how I feel." I laughed nervously. "You want me to be you? For real?" She nodded. "Just for a day. Just try. I promise it will change the way you understand yourself." I had no idea at the time that those words would unravel the version of me I thought I knew. The first step was simple, or so I thought. Elise handed me a carefully folded outfit, soft fabrics I had never worn before, colors I would never have chosen for myself. A blouse, delicate and flowing, a skirt that swayed just so, and shoes that pinched my feet in the most unfamiliar way. She guided me to a mirror, her hand brushing mine in passing, sending a jolt I couldn't explain. "Put it on," she said, "and look at yourself honestly." I obeyed, reluctantly tugging the fabrics over my body. I felt exposed, vulnerable, strange. My reflection stared back at me, a distorted version of who I believed I was. My hair fell differently now, framing my face in soft curls I had never imagined could exist there. My posture shifted instinctively, a strange combination of hesitation and grace I didn't recognize. "You're beautiful," she said, her voice calm, almost reverent. And something inside me quivered because I had never heard those words directed at me in this way. That was the beginning. The small gestures, the tiny corrections, the insistence that I mirror her perfectly, started slowly, almost imperceptibly. She guided my hands when I brushed my hair, adjusted the tilt of my chin, the curve of my shoulders. "Notice how I move," she instructed, "not just physically, but in how I carry myself, how I respond." And I did. I watched her intently, trying to mimic her every movement, every expression. It felt natural at first, like playing a character in a harmless game, but the more I mimicked, the more the line between her and me blurred. Days passed, or maybe weeks. I lost track of time. She began giving me tasks, little things at first, like matching her choice of outfit each morning, adjusting my voice to mirror hers, even practicing the way she smiled. She called it reflection training, and I went along because I was fascinated, terrified, and something deeper, unnameable, compelled me to obey. Soon, it wasn't just imitation, it was internalized. I began waking up, brushing my hair, adjusting my posture without thinking, as though her habits had become mine. Friends began to comment on subtle changes in my demeanor, how my movements had become more delicate, my expressions softer, more deliberate. I laughed nervously, brushing it off, but inside, a cold unease began to settle. One night, I caught myself standing in front of her mirror, not mine, perfectly mirroring her stance, her gaze. And in that moment, I felt a strange panic. Who was I anymore? The reflection staring back wasn't fully her, it wasn't fully me, but it was something in between, a haunting amalgam that made my chest tighten. I turned to Elise, and she smiled knowingly. "You're ready," she whispered. Ready for what? I didn't know. I wanted to pull away, to assert myself, but I found I couldn't. The training, her insistence, the careful shaping of my movements, my gestures, my expressions, it had seeped into me, like water into sponge, irreversible, consuming. She began introducing more intense exercises. I had to mimic her voice exactly, from the inflection to the rhythm of her breathing. I had to wear her scent, her jewelry, even the way she applied her makeup. She would watch me for hours, critiquing, correcting, coaxing me into perfection. At first, I rebelled in small ways, a wrong word here, a misstep there, but every correction left me more aware of the gap between my old self and this new version she was sculpting. I wanted to cry sometimes, but even that felt foreign. My emotions had been filtered through her expectations, calibrated, reshaped. The strangest part was the way I began to enjoy it. Not entirely, not purely, but the recognition, the small validation in her eyes, was addictive. I started to take pride in how perfectly I could mirror her, how seamless I had become. And yet, with every small victory, a shadow of fear crept in. I couldn't remember the last time I had moved without thinking of her, the last time I had laughed without echoing her rhythm. I had become her reflection, and it was terrifying how natural it felt. There were moments when I tried to resist. I would lock myself in the bathroom, stare at the mirror, and attempt to reclaim the person I had been before her influence. I touched my face, traced the curve of my jawline, trying to feel the me beneath the layers of training, but every reflection seemed to betray me. Even alone, I was not alone. Elise's voice, soft but insistent, echoed in my mind, "You're my reflection. You always were." I screamed at the mirror once, shaking my fists, but the reflection only smiled back, calm, composed, untouchable. The psychological grip was complete when she began asking me to speak as her, write as her, even respond to people using her expressions, her tone. Friends and colleagues started noticing the uncanny resemblance, not just in appearance, but in mannerisms, in the way I laughed, gestured, and expressed myself. I was both herself and a version of myself I no longer recognized. Sometimes, I would catch my own reflection by accident and flinch, startled by how perfectly her face had taken over mine. And yet, I could not stop. A part of me, a small, terrified, exhilarated part, loved it. One day, I realized I hadn't worn my old clothes in weeks, hadn't spoken in my old voice, hadn't laughed as I once did. Elise entered the room, smiled warmly, and said, "You're finally free." I blinked, confused. "Free?" I asked. She nodded. "Free from who you thought you were. Free from hesitation. Free to become the reflection you were always meant to be." Her words hit me with a strange clarity, and panic surged. Had I lost myself entirely? Could I reclaim the person I had been? Or had her shaping been too thorough, too precise? I spent hours staring at myself, watching the reflection smile back, perfectly composed, perfectly her. And then it dawned on me, the fear, the thrill, the obedience, even the pride I was caught in a mirror, and there was no clear edge, no escape. I was her reflection, yes, but in becoming her, I had discovered hidden aspects of myself I never knew existed. Strength, grace, adaptability, a sensitivity to the subtle rhythms of life. It was terrifying, but also oddly liberating. I realized I could never fully go back, yet perhaps, paradoxically, I had never been so fully myself. Elise laughed softly behind me, sensing my revelation. "See," she said. "You were never meant to be separate. You were always mine to discover, and I just showed you the way." I wanted to argue, to assert, to reclaim my autonomy, but even as I opened my mouth, the reflection in the mirror moved in perfect sync with her, and I felt a tremor of awe. I had been reshaped, yes, but in that reshaping, I had found a new depth to my identity, a layer I could never have explored on my own. Now, every morning, I dress, style my hair, and move through the world as her reflection. Sometimes I catch myself slipping, a flicker of my old self peeking through, and I smile softly. That part of me isn't lost, it's quietly watching, learning, blending. And though I can't escape being her reflection, I have learned to embrace it, to navigate the delicate dance between who I was, who she is, and who I have become. The mirror no longer feels like a trap, it feels like a teacher. I am still me, but I am also more than I could have imagined. I am her reflection, yes, and I cannot escape, and somehow, I am okay with that. Because in being her, I have found an unexpected freedom. Days turned into weeks, and the lines between my old self and Elise's version of me became almost indistinguishable. Every morning, I would wake before the sun, the faint light casting shadows across the room, and I would see her face staring back at me. At first, I recoiled, my heart racing with panic, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to accept it. Not completely, never fully, but enough to function, enough to follow the routines she had instilled. Her voice, her posture, the careful tilt of her head when she listened, these were no longer just exercises, they were habits embedded in my body, my muscles remembering before my mind did. Elise seemed to notice the change before I did. She smiled one morning, a small, knowing curl of her lips, and said, "You're learning faster than I expected. Soon, people won't know where I end and you begin." I laughed nervously, a sound I no longer recognized as mine. I wanted to protest, to assert that I was still me, but even as I tried, my words echoed hers. The more I spoke, the more I noticed subtle shifts in my voice, my inflections mirroring her cadence perfectly. Friends who called me during the day began to comment on the strange familiarity in my speech. "You sound different," one said. "Almost like someone else." And I swallowed hard, unsure how to explain it, because even I couldn't articulate the divide anymore. The psychological grip tightened in the most mundane ways. I found myself walking down streets, adjusting my stride to reflect hers, even when she wasn't around. My gestures, my expressions, my reactions, they were no longer just mimicry, they were instinctive. If someone said something unexpected, I responded not as myself, but as she would. I caught myself thinking in her patterns, analyzing situations the way she would, anticipating outcomes as she might. I felt a thrill, but also a profound unease, as though a part of me was observing this new self from a distance, helpless, unable to intervene. One evening, she asked me to accompany her to a small gathering of her friends. I hesitated, the thought of interacting as her, perfectly, in front of others, making my chest tighten. But I obeyed. Every word, every movement, every smile had to be practiced, precise, flawless. And yet, it worked. People complimented me, called me graceful, admired my poise. And all the while, I felt the uncomfortable thrill of recognition, the intoxicating sense of power and control in becoming her. But as I looked into a reflective surface that night, catching my own eyes in a window, I realized I barely recognized the person staring back. Her face, her posture, her voice, it had swallowed mine entirely. The fear of losing myself completely was tempered by an addictive comfort. Elise became both mentor and captor, and I, willing or not, her apprentice. She would observe me silently, sometimes for hours, her eyes piercing, her smile patient yet sharp. Every misstep, every tiny deviation from her version of perfection, was gently corrected but always noted. I began keeping a mental catalogue of every habit she had, every expression, every nuance, rehearsing them even when she wasn't present. And yet, the more I rehearsed, the more I felt like a ghost inhabiting someone else's life. There were nights I couldn't sleep, haunted by flashes of my old self. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, recalling the man I had been before Elise. My old laughter, my old gestures, the careless way I used to move, it felt foreign, almost like watching a stranger's life through a window. And yet, in the morning, the ritual of dressing, of moving, of speaking, would draw me back into her world seamlessly. The mirror had become a kind of tether, a constant reminder that I had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Then came the test she had hinted at from the very beginning. One morning, she said, "I want you to meet my family. They've never met me, but they've seen pictures. You will represent me." Panic surged, raw and visceral. My voice caught in my throat, my hands trembled, and my mind raced with the question, could I perform this flawlessly? Could I truly be her in front of others without a single crack in the illusion? I wanted to refuse, to assert my independence, but a voice inside, one shaped by her training, whispered, "You are her now. You can do this." The meeting was surreal. I sat across from people who expected Elise and saw only her reflection in me. Their compliments, their casual jokes, the ease with which they interacted, it was dizzying. Every gesture I made had to match her previous mannerisms perfectly, every smile measured. At one point, I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror across the room and froze. There she was, or I was, or some uncanny hybrid. I realized in that instant that I had fully become her reflection. Panic clawed at me, but I forced a smile, maintained eye contact, modulated my tone exactly as she would. The test was terrifying, and I passed. But the victory was hollow. I realized that while the world saw Elise, I was trapped inside, unable to separate the mask from the man underneath. Days became months. The boundaries between my identity and hers dissolved further. I could no longer remember the last time I had spoken purely as myself. Even in solitude, my thoughts carried her inflections, her judgments, her worldview. I began to write in her style, to think in her patterns, to respond to the world as she would. My old habits, the careless ones, the spontaneous ones, faded like shadows at noon. And yet, I noticed subtleties in myself that had never existed before: patience, awareness, an attention to detail, a sensitivity to the emotional currents of others. I had been reshaped, not entirely lost, but altered, sharpened, focused through her prism. One evening, exhausted, I stood before the mirror, brushing my hair, adjusting the collar of my blouse, and I whispered to myself, "Who am I anymore?" The reflection smiled back, perfectly composed, a hybrid of her and me, unidentifiable, undeniable. The truth hit me like a cold wave. I could not escape, and I did not want to. Somewhere in the terror, in the surrender, in the meticulous mimicry, I had discovered a new depth to myself. I was her reflection, yes, but I was still myself, just refracted, altered, multiplied. And for the first time, I understood what she meant. Freedom was not in escape but in acceptance, in embracing the parts of myself I had never dared to explore. Elise watched silently from the doorway, a quiet smile on her lips. "You see it now," she said softly. "You're not lost. You're more alive than ever. You've become my reflection, but you've also found a new reflection of yourself. And that's something you could never have discovered alone." I nodded slowly, staring at the mirror, at the face that was hers, mine, and something in between. Fear, exhilaration, recognition, and liberation swirled together in a complex dance. I was trapped, yes, but it was no longer a prison. It was a revelation. I understood finally that identity is not a single, rigid line. It is fluid, mutable, a reflection shaped by others, by experience, by choice. And sometimes, surrendering control, letting yourself become someone else, allows you to see the world, and yourself, more clearly than you ever could alone. I am her reflection, and I cannot escape, but I have learned to move through the world with grace, with awareness, with a strange, thrilling sense of freedom. In becoming her, I have discovered new layers of me, and I know now that this is not the end, but a beginning, a transformation that will continue for as long as I let it. The following weeks were a blur of routine and perfection. Each morning, I woke to the gentle sunlight spilling across her apartment, and each morning, I found myself instinctively performing the rituals she had instilled in me. My hair, my posture, my expressions all automatically mirrored her. There was no thought required. The actions had become reflexive, a second nature I couldn't escape. I caught myself smiling at strangers in the street, adjusting my stance when someone passed by, speaking with a cadence that wasn't mine yet somehow felt more natural than my own voice ever had. And yet, beneath the surface, a storm churned. There were moments, fleeting and sudden, when my reflection in the mirror would seem alien. The face looking back at me was hers, perfectly her, but when I focused on my eyes, I saw a shadow, a flicker of the person I had been before she claimed me. It was subtle at first, a mere hesitation in my gaze, a twitch in my lips, but it terrified me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the perfection, but the shadow lingered. Sometimes, I would touch my face, tracing the contours, trying to feel a memory of myself underneath, and it felt like reaching through fog. Elise noticed these moments. She never scolded or corrected. Instead, she watched, quiet and patient, like a gardener observing a plant struggling to grow in the right direction. "You're aware of it," she said once, her voice calm but sharp, "and that awareness is important. It means you're evolving, not disappearing." I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat, unsure if I believed her. Was I evolving, or was I dissolving? Was I learning something new about myself, or losing the essence of who I had been? One evening, she presented me with a new challenge. "Tonight, I want you to live as me entirely. You will leave this apartment, go out into the city, interact with strangers, respond to situations exactly as I would. No hesitation, no deviation. You will be me, completely." My stomach twisted. The thought of leaving the safety of her observation, of the controlled environment, was terrifying. But I felt a strange compulsion to obey, to see how far I had truly come. I agreed, my voice catching, but already echoing her calm, deliberate tone. The city felt different through her eyes. Every gesture, every glance, every word I spoke had to match her perfectly. I watched the people around me, gauging reactions, adjusting my movements, my expressions. I was both exhilarated and paralyzed. The freedom of walking in the world, interacting without being questioned, was intoxicating. Yet every step, every word reminded me that I was performing, that I was a reflection, not the original. I could feel the separation from my old self like a tether stretching thinner and thinner. At a small cafe, a stranger approached, struck by my presence. You seem familiar," she said, smiling. My heart pounded. Every instinct screamed to answer naturally, as myself, but I remembered Elise's training. I responded as she would, poised, calm, attentive. The conversation flowed, seamless, effortless. And in that moment, I realized I could embody her entirely. I could live in the world as her, as a perfect reflection. But at what cost? The thought clawed at me. My old self was fading, a ghost in the corners of my mind, a whisper I could barely hear over the cadence of her voice now living in me. Returning to the apartment, I found Elise waiting, watching. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You did well," she said softly. Relief and dread mingled in my chest. She was right. I had performed flawlessly. But as I removed her clothes, hung them neatly in her closet, and stared into the mirror, I realized I had become her in ways that went far beyond the physical. Her habits, her mannerisms, her very way of thinking, they had merged with mine. I could no longer distinguish where she ended and I began. Sleep that night was restless. I dreamt of mirrors, reflections multiplying, faces shifting between mine and hers, impossible and haunting. I woke drenched in sweat, the sound of my own breathing loud in the quiet room. And yet, despite the fear, there was an undeniable fascination, a curiosity about how far this transformation could go. I was trapped, yes, but in the trap, I discovered a clarity I had never known. I could observe myself, my emotions, my reactions, through the lens of another person, and it revealed layers I had never explored. Over time, I realized that being her reflection wasn't just about appearance or behavior, it was about perspective, about empathy, about seeing the world through another lens. I felt her emotions before my own, sensed her moods in subtle cues, anticipated reactions as she would. The process was exhausting, but also illuminating. I learned patience, awareness, subtlety, a grace that had never existed in my previous life. I was changing, not erasing, but evolving into something new, something neither fully her nor fully me, but a synthesis I couldn't have achieved alone. Yet the shadow of fear remained. Occasionally, in a quiet moment, I would touch my face, trace the lines, and feel a flicker of resistance, a yearning for independence. But those moments were fleeting. I had become conditioned to respond, to adjust, to reflect. And in that reflection, I found an unexpected power. People responded to me differently now. They saw something compelling, something precise, something controlled. The world treated me as her, and in doing so, treated me as someone greater than I had ever been alone. I began to understand Elise's intention fully. She had not just wanted me to mimic her, she had wanted me to learn, to evolve, to discover parts of myself I could not reach on my own. Her reflection was a tool, a mirror, a pathway to self-discovery. And though it terrified me, it also thrilled me. I could not escape her influence, but perhaps, paradoxically, I did not want to. In becoming her, I had found a version of myself I could never have imagined, capable, perceptive, adaptable, aware. Standing once again in front of the mirror, I saw the face I had come to inhabit. Not mine, not entirely hers, but a fusion, a living reflection that carried pieces of both. I touched my cheek, feeling the contours, the softness, the unfamiliar strength. I realized that escape was impossible, yes, but the fear that had once gripped me had transformed into awe. I had been reshaped, forged through observation, mimicry, and surrender. I was her reflection, and I could not escape, but I could live fully within it, explore its possibilities, and embrace the new identity it offered. Elise appeared beside me, silent, observing. I looked at her, And for the first time, I understood the quiet depth behind her eyes. "You've become more than you knew," she whispered. And in that moment, I believed her. Not because I had lost myself, but because I had discovered a version of myself I had never imagined. Fear, control, surrender, reflection, they had all fused into something new, something alive. I was no longer just a man, no longer just a reflection. I was an evolving synthesis, a living testament to transformation. I am her reflection. I cannot escape. And somehow, I have never felt more awake. Weeks blended into months, and the boundaries between her and me dissolved almost completely. I no longer noticed when my own voice gave way to hers, or when my gestures slipped seamlessly into patterns I had once thought alien. The mirror no longer startled me with its uncanny mimicry. I would stand before it and feel a strange calm, a merging of two identities into one living reflection. And yet, deep inside, a faint spark of resistance lingered, subtle but persistent, like a shadow that refused to vanish completely. One night, I found myself wandering the apartment after everyone had gone to sleep. Elise's clothes were neatly folded in the closet, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the soft hum of the city outside filtering through the window. I picked up a mirror, held it before me, and for the first time, looked long and hard not just at her reflection, not just at the version of me she had created, but at the space between. The eyes staring back were familiar yet strange, mine yet hers, caught in a delicate dance of identity I could neither untangle nor fully claim. I felt a wave of fear, sudden and sharp. Who was I if I could no longer distinguish myself from her? What remained of the person I had been before her influence took root? I traced my fingers along the contours of my face, trying to reconnect with memories of laughter, gestures, and habits that had once defined me. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying yet exhilarating. I could no longer escape her reflection, but neither could I erase the parts of myself that had survived, subtle, quiet, persistent. Elise entered silently, her presence as commanding as ever, yet gentle. She observed me, waiting for a reaction. I expected correction, instruction, perhaps a critique, but she said nothing. Instead, she approached, standing beside me, and whispered, "You've become fully aware now. You see the reflection for what it is, not a prison, but a lens. You can explore, adapt, and discover. You can't escape me, but you can discover yourself through me." Her words resonated in a strange, almost paradoxical way. I understood finally that the power she held over me was not simply control, it was revelation. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest slowly release. The fear was still there, lurking like a quiet undertone, but the dread had transformed into curiosity, into acceptance. I could not escape being her reflection, and yet, in that surrender, I found freedom. I was not the same person I had been. I had been reshaped, retrained, refracted through her influence, but I had also discovered layers of perception, sensitivity, and self-awareness I could never have achieved alone. For the first time, I allowed myself to smile fully at my reflection, to see both her face and mine simultaneously, merged into something entirely new. I realized that identity is never fixed, never singular. It is fluid, mutable, shaped by experiences, by influence, by connection. And sometimes, surrendering control, letting yourself be molded, allows you to find strength in unexpected ways. I had become her reflection, and I could not escape, but perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps the point was to see, to feel, to understand, and to evolve. Elise placed her hand lightly on my shoulder, and I felt a grounding warmth, a silent affirmation. I no longer feared the reflection in the mirror. I had learned to inhabit it fully, to move through the world with her grace and my awareness intertwined. I had been shaped, yes, but in the shaping, I had discovered a new version of myself, complex, resilient, perceptive, alive. I took one last look at the mirror before turning away. The face staring back would always be hers, yet it would always carry the echo of me. And as I stepped into the world, moving exactly as she would, yet feeling the subtle currents of my own self beneath it all, I understood the final truth. I was no longer just a reflection, and yet I could never escape being one. The fear had transformed into acceptance. The control had become revelation. I was her reflection. I could not escape. And somehow, in that impossibility, I had never felt more awake. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, embracing the fusion of identities. Somewhere deep inside, the old me remained, quiet but aware, observing through the prism of her influence. And the new me, shaped by her guidance, moved forward into the world with clarity, precision, and a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. The mirror no longer held terror. It held possibility. I am her reflection. I cannot escape. And yet, in that reflection, I have discovered a depth of self I could never have known before. I am caught, yes, but I am alive, evolving, and fully awake to the world as it truly is and as I truly am, both hers and my own, inseparable and unending.